Hey, hello. Here's a video request by Cranty. I hope the volume's right. This is my new operating system. Cranty Nubwani, my Taiwanese subscriber, who is a computer programmer or web designer, who has to do the high end stuff, so he can't do the audiobooks while he works. So he wanted me to do a rundown on Roman Republic turning into Roman Empire. So I read up on some stuff for a couple days first, refresher course, because this is, oh, and I'm super high right now. I got had like 20 hits of top shelf weed, and now I'm starting to feel higher. I got this stuff. I want to get the concentrates more, but they're hard on my lungs. So yeah, it's an important video because it's the most interesting period of history, I think. Um, Neil deGrasse Tyson was telling Joe Rogan the other day that he thinks um, Columbus discovering America is the most important time, and it creates some interesting stuff happened after that, like how the Spanish armies could come over and take over the Incas and the Aztecs. But if you're going to talk about the ancient world and the most interesting 50-year period of history, 100-year period of history would be the Rome. One interesting thing that I don't think the end of the Roman Republic. One interesting thing that people don't think about, that I didn't really think about, is that when you think about the Roman Empire lasted for 1,000 years, and but everything that you think about the Roman Empire happened within a 100-year period, pretty much. It was just like all the players knew each other, the entire story, and that was the period of the end of the Republic and the beginning of the Empire. That's where all of the literature is about, like 90% of the literature. There's other periods of there's two periods of Rome that have all the literature. Pretty much, it's that period, end of the Rome, the Republic, and then the Christian, the end of the Roman Empire, like right before the end of the Roman Empire, with all the Christian writers talking about all their philosophy, and in their talking, you get an idea of what the world was like. So those are the two periods, but if you're the more interesting of those two periods are the end of the Republic, because that's where all the interesting stuff was happening. It's not just somebody philosophizing. So yeah, so it would so the interesting juicy times come from like where it starts to change is from Sulla on down through, I guess, Nero. So uh, okay, so let's talk about some paradoxical things. Um, Rome became a republic to an empire. Okay, now an empire is something that controls the whole world. At the same time that it became a democratically elected democracy to a hereditary autocracy. So it might make people think that in order to control the whole world, you have to make your country autocracy. And that's the juicy part about this whole video. That's what makes it so fascinating. And so I don't think it's necessary to have an Let's talk about how it happened, just really simply. Um, when they become a big empire, they have to be controlled by an army, and traditionally, an army is an autocratic system. In ancient Rome, they'd have their democracy, and they have the way that their democracy in ancient Roman Republic. Yeah, because I think the video request was talk about the Roman Republic. So yeah, let's just give a really quick history of the Roman Republic. So Rome was started in 753 BC by Romulus, who was a member of the royal family of Alba Longa, which was started in like 1150 BC. So that that was like 400 years. For 30 years, their capital was on the shore. It's called Latinia, and they were a people, the Latins, who were founded by Aeneas, who was the prince of Troy. So Troy, he escaped Troy after it got captured. They went to Italy, and Italy had always been like a place on the route. It was a place in the civilized world. Hercules made a stop there, and Rome actually was always a like a holy city. And so Aeneas came and he teamed up with the locals. They were called the Aborigines. That's what their tribe was called, and I think so. And yeah, and they started the Latins. And anyway, so so it was a kingdom, but then it was after 244 years of being a kingdom. They had a bad king, Tarquinius, who was overworking everybody and uh, suppressing people. So they had a revolution. And one interesting thing about that is that 244 years after the writing of the U.S. Constitution, 1886, that's going to be 2030. That's the 244 year anniversary, and that's the day. That's the year that this guy, I think his name is Richard Tainter, writes about collapses of civilizations, or some, but a famous economist or a guy who wrote a big book that who's Richard Wolff is talking about it. Anyway, he thinks that American empire is going to collapse in the year 2030. So it's it's like. There are these guys who talk about generations, and there's the generational cycles, and so yeah, maybe we have this. I think we have this interior clock built into our society, based on number of generations, that you kind of have to have a reevaluation of your political system. So, anyways, that was 250 years, 244 years, and then that's kind of like the golden era of Rome. Where they had they had the most democratic, I think, city state ever. The Athenians had this thing, I think, that was purely democratic. People would go. I think it was 6,000 people could go to the Agora Forum and vote for whoever was going to be their leader. But the most the the best one I can think of is Rome. And so they'd have these guys, the consuls, and they'd have two consuls. And one consul could veto the other consul. And one guy had the precedence over the other one, I think, for 1 day. So they'd stagger it. And they would only get to be the consuls for 1 year. And then they'd have to elect new consuls. So if you look at their consul list, it's really long because it's just 1 year. I think they have the same thing with the Athens. They'd have their archon for 1 year. But yeah, so that's better than America. We do it every 4 years. And so the way that they did it is when they stopped the kingdom, they just had all the rules that the king had just transferred to the consul, but they didn't have a written constitution that we know of. And so that was going on. Rome was doing well, and then they took over all of Italy, and because they were the one city state, they had the best political system. I think they were the most democratic. and all inclusive ever since the beginning. That's how it was started. It was started as a city from scratch, so they included everybody, all of the outcasts from all the different races. It's some kind of a meeting place of different races. Etruscans on the north, who looked different, like different. You could tell by looking at them, and then the Sabins up in the mountains, and then the Latins, and so they all learned to get along, and then the third king turned it into a holy place to further gain, which I think it already was, but he officially made it. They had they made a bunch of temples and made like official religion, and Numa Pompilius, I think was his name, and he wasn't even a Roman. He was a Sabinian. So their third king was already a foreigner. So they had this tradition of kind of like a meritocracy. And they actually hunted him down. He wasn't even living in Rome. They went and got him because they heard he was the smartest guy in the area. So Rome's doing well, and they're taking over, and they're very democratic. And so that's the thing that you need to take away from Roman Republic, is that they're the most democratic society where they celebrated, the individual and empowering the individual, and so. So anyway, they end up having a battle. They have a showdown with Carthage, which was the other big power. Rome had all of Italy, and Carthage had all of northern Africa and Spain, and so then I think they started fighting over Sicily, and Rome ends up having these three big wars with Carthage, and they beat Carthage, and I'm trying to zoom to the end of the Republic, beginning of the Empire. So they beat Carthage, but the problem is, and then they take over Carthage and they get wealthy as an empire. But the problem is, the war with Carthage ravaged Italy because Hannibal came in from the north with all of his elephants over the mountains into Italy and was there for like years, and was kicking the Romans' asses and almost could have taken over Rome, but didn't. For some reason, but they eventually beat him. But he ravaged the countryside. He made it so that the farmers couldn't farm for a few years, and so the Roman bankers. Okay, this is another thing I wanted to talk about. I shouldn't get sidetracked because I'll lose my train of thought because I'm high. But yeah, the problems with the falls of empires and stuff, it's always the same thing. It's always from the same causes. Yeah, I think I will get sidetracked, and then I'll try to pick up. Actually, I won't. So where was I? Oh, right. So they got ravaged. So the bankers made all of the farmers pay all of their the same taxes that they had to pay before, but they couldn't grow their plants. So it wasn't fair. So it was like one of these tricks, banker tricks. So instead of changing the laws and understanding that they, being realistic with people, they just threw them in jail and took over their land and gave it to the rich people. And so that's where this big wealth discrepancy problem in Rome happened. So I think the main moral of the story is that it's just really difficult to transform into a really big, complex society and keep it democratic because of just the natural flow of communication maybe gets lost in translation, and people just start fighting, and so then you just have to make it simple and then have an autocracy. So and also the lack of communication causing people to not be able to make those banking adjustments. So they ended up having a revolution. They were about to get taken over by a neighboring tribe, and the poor people refused to fight. So they had to make concessions, and they made a law that no one person could own more than 500 jugera of land, which is 1.36 square kilometers, which is the same size as one of those crops. If you look at the Earth, America, and Google Earth, and you see those circular crop formations, it's about that size. And so Rome was doing okay, but the first signs of the fall of the empire of the democratically elected, where they were able to have these consuls who were getting elected, and then they would act as the boss, like the king, and then every year it was another guy, And if you wanted to run again, you could run again. You just had to, wait a year. So there were guys who were consuls 5 and 6 times. So it's kind of similar to a president, I guess the same amount of time as we have presidents now. We have it 4 to 8 years. So, maybe once in a while you'd have, the consul with 4 times would be, it was less time actually then, an 8-time consul was, didn't happen so much. So, it was a really good system that they had, and they respected it, and they had their senators of 300 senators. I think it was 100 in the beginning, and then 300, and who they all deliberated and represented everybody. But then with this wealth discrepancy problem, they had these 2 brothers, the Gracchus brothers, who made those laws. It was called Lex Licinia, the land law. But they got killed by aristocratic factions. And then, so the beginning of the end happened with Sulla. He was the first guy who showed that being a general, just you could take over the whole country. Before that, what they did was, if they had to have a big general to fight a battle, they would make him a dictator. And I think it was for 10 days, the first one. There was a guy called Cincinnatus. They made him dictator. He went, and so now he had like autocratic control, so that there was no wasting of time and deliberating, and it was like one head controlling the whole body. And that's the argument for why you would want an autocratic system for an empire, because it's just too complicated for too many people, because we can't get along. But he was a hero because at the end of the war, he gave up his office like he said he would, and he went back to his farm. And so everybody held him up to be the greatest Roman ever, the example of the Roman who thinks for the people and not for himself. And they even had it in their flag. They had the flag was actually words that said "We the people" in Latin. And everybody else that would have a flag of the king, their king's face, or maybe the emblem of their country or something, but they had words that said we are the country of the people. So with no one person ever being able to take over. And ever since the beginning, they had that pride. Even from the very first king, Romulus. Romulus started Rome when he was 18, and just out of nothing. And so it was this kind of, total meritocracy, inviting anybody over. Kind of like tribal. Where if you didn't like the chief, you just kill him. So anyways, that's what a lot of people think what happened to him. He'd been king for 30 years, so 18, 28, 38, 48. He's still in his prime, and he was out there in Campus Martius watching his people, his army, do their exercises, and then he just died. And they say that all the senators around him said it was this magical dust bowl came and swept him up to the heavens, but other people thought maybe they killed him because they didn't like how he was the king, and they wanted to make it more of a democracy. And so their second king, it wasn't the third king. Their second king, they actually, like I said, they went up into the mountains and they found some old guy, Numa Pompilius, and brought him down just because he was a scholar, and that's when he made all those religious laws. So that's what Rome was. and it was a democracy. And they were probably comparing themselves with ancient Athens. Athens was a pure democracy too at the same time. When Rome turned into a republic in 510 BC, and Athens had all those Pericles and Socrates and those guys. That was in the 400s, so that was at the same time as the very first consuls of Rome. And so anyway, but Sulla was a general, and who went over to. They had a battle with a neighboring kingdom because this guy Jugurtha, king of Numidia, which is in modern day Tunisia, he took over the rest of the country from his brothers illegally, and he wasn't even the legitimate heir. He was just this he was from the prostitute of his grandson, and so he was a bad dude. And so Rome went over and tried to and squashed him, but he actually went over and bribed a bunch of Romans to help his cause. And but Jugurtha, Sallust, Sulla was the general who took over Numidia, and he came back and was having problems with the consul. What was his name? Marius, who was like 30 years older than him, and wasn't giving him proper respect. And they are having. I need to listen to that book again, The Jugurthan War. It's a 150-page book written by Sallust, who was, I think, a contemporary. It's on my website. And he also wrote another book. Catiline Conspiracy. And so Sulla comes back into Rome and with an army and takes over Rome with his army, which no Roman had done before. Rome had always been, they'd send the general was always subject to the consul and the senate, and so that set a precedent. So gave other people idea maybe they could do it, but he was a good guy. He killed, I think it was 9,000 followers of his political opponent, and that also had never been done before. It's like a genocide, and he was like autocratic dictator, but then he quit and he went and retired to his farm, just like Cincinnatus. So there was still that sentiment of people trying to keep it democratic, but what he didn't realize probably is that every time you do something that's that strong, you're chipping away at the democracy. You can't go and kill 9,000 people just because they follow somebody else, your opponent. So they were. So what happened after that? And then he was going to kill Julius Caesar. He was one of the followers of the wrong side, but Julius Caesar escaped. And so anyway, then they had some more. And then what happened was Rome. Here's the part of the transference from the Republic to the Empire. Rome really turned into an empire now. Now it wasn't just Italy. Now they had taken over Numidia, and now Julius Caesar takes over France, which had 5 million people, and he took it over with 20,000 soldiers. Another thing about Rome is that they were very strong, and they were disciplined, and they prided themselves on their ability to be good warriors. And if you want to be a good warrior, that means being a good athlete, which means trading all the time, which means not having the time to buy things, and beautify and spend all of your extra time and money with plants or whatever. And so they were very capable. Yeah, and they took over all of France and killed 1 million people while they did it. And so they got really rich. Every time you take over another country, you get this huge bonus. Maybe that's where the CEOs of these multinational corporations get their bonus idea. They feel like they just took over a new segment of the population, and this is their pillage money. So that made Rome, but it's like a one-time injection, because basically what you're doing is it's like you're going into the other country, you take all their gold reserves and you bring them to your country, and then you use it to build stuff, and then their people, you take all their people back to work as slaves, and so it makes you really rich. So and that I'll talk about that later. So they take over France, and then they take over Spain. That was after the Carthaginians, and then they took over all of Greece, and that's another book, I think, or that was with the I can't remember him, but anyway, and so then they tried to take over Syria too, and that's where Crassus comes in. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. But my friend wanted me to talk about Crassus. And all right, so let's talk about Crassus. He was the richest guy ever in the history of the world. That's what my friend's name is. Yeah, and I would say if you ever wanted to, I think it was even a saying that everybody said, and maybe they still say it. They were like, rich as Crassus. I want to be as rich as Crassus. And that's who they're talking about. Before it was rich as Croesus, Creosus, who was the king of Lydia. But he was taken over by Cyrus and was made to be his advisor until Cyrus got killed. But yeah, Crassus was this Roman in the Roman Republic. But this was at the end of the Roman Republic, where Rome had become an empire, because they took over Africa and Spain from the Carthaginians and the Numidians. And so it was kind of, you had the first triumvirate, and this was the first time where it wasn't really so much the consul, it was now just rich dudes. And so the triumvirate was Julius Caesar, and he was rich off his ass from France. Crassus, who was rich from just being rich, probably from all of the taking the land back from people, cheating with the bankers, and then there was this other guy called Lepidus, who was another one of these rich guys, but he was we don't talk about him. Crassus got super rich because there was this fire in Rome, and so he just rebuilt all of everybody's houses that I guess previously they were owners of. And so now they were his houses, and so he rented them out for his whatever he wanted to. And so this is how rich Crassus was. This is why they say rich as Crassus. He owned maybe, I don't know how, they probably had an estimate of how much he owned. It was like a quarter of the city was his or something. But, and there's actually, there's a 57-page article written about him on my website by somebody, one of the contemporaries, one of those ancient Roman writers who did a biography book about people, and he was one of the guys. And that was one of the books I read the other day in preparation for this video. And yeah, Crassus was just a crude, backstabbing, lying, throw parties for gangs of people just to get him on his side or whatever, just like a Donald Trump. I got the idea he was like a Donald Trump type of guy, not a scholar. So anyway, lazy. So this is how rich Crassus was. So Julius Caesar is taking over France and getting rich off of his ass, and so Crassus wants to get rich, and and so this is actually kind of like the beginning of the end if you're talking about like the morals of Rome, um, because you've got this triumvirate, so it's like these three kings instead of following their consul being in charge, and then every year it's a new people in charge, and that had been going on for Julius Caesar died in 54 BC, and so we're talking like like 70 BC or whatever. So from 510, so for 450 years, so a long ass time, more than 400 years, it had been a this steady political system, and so and now they got this huge injection of wealth, so it's super destabilizing. So you see these three kings. Anyway, Julius Caesar and then Crassus. Okay, so Crassus wanted to take over the who are they called? The Parthian Empire. They were a huge empire, all of the Middle East. Okay, we're like a competitor to Rome, and this is the Middle East, so they're more ancient society than the Romans, and so he wants to take them over, and he goes over to Syria. But all the other Romans didn't want him to. All the Senate told him it was a crazy idea. He couldn't do it. It's too much. It's the Parthians. Like Julius Caesar's we're already got our hands full with this Julius Caesar guy. But, he was so rich that his rich wealth was able to trump the actual country. He was like richer than the whole country. A fascist state is a country where the richest guys, the richest businessmen in the country have more money and power than the actual country. So it actually is not even a country anymore. It's just kind of like pretending to be a country. And a lot of people say that there's so many parallels you can make between America and Rome. And that's what's so fascinating about this video. Because when you make the comparisons, you're talking about this period of time, I think, more than anything. This period of time and then the fall of Rome. But you have all of these. There is a study. Some political scientists did a study, and all of that's well known, and they studied the percentages from all the polls of what people want of the laws to be. 70% for Medicare for all, and 70% get out of wars and all this kind of stuff. And then you look at the actual laws that are passed, and then you compare the laws and then the desires of the wealthy, from what their lobbyists want, and you compare it, and the laws that are actually written are the laws of the lobbyists and the rich people, and they're not the laws of the actual people. Okay, so we're already in a fascist society, and then they get the stupid of us to believe their way by doing Fox News and doing all these straw man arguments, like this transgender or whatever, so that they can then turn around and say that it's the communists' fault that why we need to stay fascist. So anyways, I'll talk more about that later in this video. So that's basically what Rome had become, like it was like if some rich guy wanted to take over Iran because he was the king of Boeing, or he owned Boeing and Northrop or whatever, and all those contractors are, and they want bonuses, and they want to be able to feed the mouths of all of their like acolytes, and so they want to take over Iran so that they can sell the government and us taxpayers the weapons to kill the Iranians. And so we end up killing the Iranian. Oh wait, we already did that with Iraq, didn't we? It's like that. The people didn't want. People were marching in the streets against it, and all over the world. I was in Chile, like everybody. Nobody wanted it, but we did it anyway because we were fascists. And so that's basically Crassus. Crassus is like, yeah, I want to take over like I want to take over the Middle East. And so all of the Senate was like, no, like everybody will die. Like, why do we need to take over them? And he's like, oh, fuck you, I'm gonna go do it. And anyway, so what he did is he did one of these and bought his own army. I don't know how many legions it was, but it was like thousands and thousands of people, like 50,000 or whatever, a huge army. Julius Caesar had 20,000, so it was just 4 legions or something. Legions is 5,000 people. So he marches up to with his own private bought army to Syria, but he was an idiot, and he allowed himself to get led in by like false scouts, traitors, into a valley where he could get ambushed by all of the Syrians, and without finding out what's going on first, like how Julius Caesar did. You should read Julius Caesar's book about how he did battle. I mean, he had his shit together. So Crassus then ended up getting killed there, and I think most of the army. So it was just this giant waste of money. It was like Iraq won. First it was Crassus, and then it was George Bush with Iraq. So he was out of the picture. But now that you have this triumvirate, that's, I mean, people should, and I think people were. There's predicting that was kind of the beginning of the end, and we were in a dangerous situation. The most prolific Roman writer ever is Cicero, and he wrote like 3,000 pages of like philosophy and his law arguments, and he was the consul of Rome at this time. It was Cicero against versus. Man, I shouldn't have gotten so high before doing this video. But it was, Cicero was basically these guys. Oh my God, I can't believe I should put my glasses on. I should have put my computer on and looked at my timeline while I did this. But Cicero was about the same time as Caesar and those guys. And he was preaching against all of these... all the corruption and the people trying to underhand the people, and trying to remind everybody that Rome was about the people. And he ended up getting his head cut off, just assassinated. The people were trying to protect him. They were camping in his front lawn because they knew the rich people were going to come and try and get him assassinated. But they ended up ambushing him in his carriage and cut his head off. And then they cut off a bunch of the other like pro-democracy Senate guys. And I don't know if Cicero may have actually been, I need to study up on this more, the consul at the time when he got assassinated, but that was it. After that, everybody knows about Rome, about Caesar. Caesar comes back after taking over France, and the law said, and this is why Caesar is this big. I remember when I was a kid, Caesar was the most famous Roman, and the greatest Roman, and he was the most impressive person ever because he was the best soldier ever, taking over a country of 5 million people with 20,000 people. And that was an ancient society too. Like, they were more advanced than the Italians. I think when he redid the Italian calendar, it was from stuff he learned from the Celts up in France, because they were farther north and they had more information about stars. And they're ancient, and so that was impressive. And then he took over armies bigger than his in his civil wars, when he beat Pompey, who was another great general. That was an army twice his size, and he was also a really good writer. He wrote all of his books. He was said to have been able to write 7 letters at once, from scribes. And people were always reading books to him and stuff. But that's what those books, all of his writing is from. It's actually his reports that he would send back to Rome. And yeah, just the way that he gained power and supported the people. And but at the same time, he was one of these agents of destroying the fabric of the democratic zeitgeist that they had, the democratic respect for the people's authority, and distrust for people always wanting to become king. They always remembered that. And so he came back from France, and what he was the governor of France, or that part, the northern part. Well, I guess France, but before they took over France, that part of the part next to France. And so he wasn't supposed to come into to Italy as governor or with his army, because the army belonged to the people. He was just the governor of France. He was just supposed to come back to Italy and be as a subordinate to the consul. But he came back with his army, and that's what the whole saying from crossing the Rubicon, because the Rubicon was the borderline between his province. And so when he crossed it, that was a signal to them that he was coming with his army to take over all of Rome, like how Sulla did. So now he was, so that broke like the cardinal rule. When they first became a republic in 510 BC with Brutus, they didn't have a constitution. They made a constitution in, I think, the 300s or 400s called the 12 Tablets. From this the Decemviri, there were like the 10 consuls that they had for a little bit, but they did have one golden rule. So the very first basically the original constitution of the Roman Republic was kill anybody who tries to become king. That was the first thing that they said when they made the consuls, because that's the one thing that you need in order to keep your political system going. Is every time your year comes up, you have to leave to let the other guy in. You know, because if you don't leave, well, then all our whole idea about this whole consuls and the rules of the republic is gone. So anyways, and they remembered that, and so that's why Julius Caesar was killed by Brutus, who was a descendant of the original Brutus. But so Julius Caesar comes in. They had the civil war. He wins, but then he gets killed by Brutus. And then Brutus gets people understand it at the beginning, but then they read Caesar's will, and he gave all of his money to the people, and so they turned against the people who killed Caesar. And they started looking at him like a god, and so they first they put the guys who killed him, Brutus and those guys, as governors of territories on the outer skirts, so that they wouldn't have problems. But then I think they ended up getting assassinated. I don't think a single person who killed Caesar lived more than 3 years afterwards. So yeah, it's just interesting. This particular part of history right now, like the 3 years after the death of Caesar, could be psychologically the most interesting part of history that ever happened, because you officially had a Roman Republic that had been around for 450 years, and you had all of these educated Romans. Cicero had just been not assassinated not so long before that, so you could have gone back to the way it was, but just because of all of the erosion to the idea of democracy that had happened beforehand, and that had been so fresh in people's minds, that people were just numb to the idea of having the consuls. And but another argument, maybe that it was just too big, because now they had to have an army to constantly keep all of these all of these provinces in check. You know, like it was the Roman Empire was pretty much at its fully grown extent at that point. The only thing that they had to take over in order to make it a little bit bigger would have been Dacia, Romania, and then Iraq. But they only had that Iraq for a little bit, and Dacia wasn't for very long either. So, um, so they had more civil wars. So they had been ravaged by civil wars after Caesar, but then they had another set of civil wars after that. That was that was with Augustus, who was the adopted son of Julius Caesar. Um, and people were supporting him. He was only 18 when Caesar died. He came back to France, Rome, and got support. And then there was Mark Antony, who was actual consul of Rome when Caesar was killed. It was two consuls. Caesar was consul and Mark Antony were consul, but Caesar had made himself dictator for life, and so that was what pissed people off, and that's where he screwed up. He shouldn't have done that. So Mark Antony was consul. He could have been consul and then let himself retire from consulship, and then let another consul come in. So you could blame the entire autocratic system of the Roman Empire on one person, Mark Antony. So because he tried to make himself king like how Julius Caesar did, because Mark Antony was just a soldier. He probably wasn't. I mean, he came from a good family, but I don't know. He probably wasn't educated enough to have enough respect, and that was actually the reputation he had. Mark Antony was just a womanizing drunk. Cicero, in fact, maybe it was Mark Antony who had Cicero killed, because Cicero wrote a book called the Philippics. It's called Philippics because it's when a Philippic is a type of book that you wrote in the ancient times where you rail into somebody politically. You just trash them, and it's called Philippics because somebody trashed. I think the king of Greece called Philip, and so yeah, he wrote this book called Philippics where he just trashed Mark Antony and called him a drunk, and he just barfs in front of people and steals people's wives from him and is like a total tyrant, and all he can do is fight battles, but he's not a scholar. And so that was the guy who was consul. And then so he tried to make himself king, and so I guess Augustus was like, well, we can't let this guy become king, so I'll fight him. So they have their civil wars. Mark Antony Mark Antony had his own army too. He was like powerful. And he tried to take over. Julius Caesar was going to take over the Middle East. He was going to take over the Parthians, just like Crassus tried to. Julius Caesar was the only Roman who actually encouraged Crassus to do it. But he got killed. Julius Caesar got assassinated. So then Mark Antony went over to try to do it. But Mark Antony was a bumbling fool. He would instead of having horses pull his war chariot, he'd have lions pull his war chariot, and then I think he got like misled in the mountains, and anyway he failed, but he didn't die trying to take over. But then he teamed up with Cleopatra, and he was going, but then Cleopatra like Greekified him, and he was gonna. Romans were afraid he was gonna try to make a separate Roman Empire based out of Greece. Based out of Egypt, and then maybe eventually try to take over the western part of the Roman Empire. So to start new civil wars. So that's when Agrippa and Augustus had declared war against Mark Antony, and they managed to beat Mark Antony in the Battle of Actium, which I think is in the modern day islands of Croatia, where they had they had the navy of Cleopatra, and she was the leader of the navy. She was the queen of Egypt, so the Egyptian navy, and then Mark Antony, because it was like a civil war. Mark Antony's legions of Romans, and Cleopatra, fled from the scene in her boats because they were getting beat, and then Mark Antony escaped too, and so they lost, and went back to Egypt, and they were going to end up getting taken over because they lost too many of their ships in the Battle of Actium, and so they committed suicide in a pretty pathetic way. I think it's the original story of Romeo and Juliet. Uh, um, yeah, like Cleopatra heard that Mark Antony killed himself, so Cleopatra jumped into a coffin with a bunch of vipers and had herself bitten to death. So then Mark Antony. Oh, no, that's not what happened. Mark Antony heard that that's what she did. So then he stabbed himself and was bleeding out. But then someone told him, and they were like in the same town but in different buildings, being besieged by the Romans. You know, they only have a few days left until they get taken over, and because Mark Antony's people had deserted him. Mark Antony was a bumbling idiot. He blew all of his money on parties all the time. He had like these epic feasts of where they had like 7 boars or something, and they would have like hundreds of people, and he just was blowing all. He was like Commodus. Later on, he just blew all the money, and Cleopatra was going along with it, and so they eventually deserted him. So he stabs himself because he hears that she kills herself, but then someone tells him that, oh no, she's still alive. So he's already dying. So he gets somebody to help him, like, get to her house, but they can't get up into the building because it's being besieged by the Romans or something. So they had to take him up to her balcony window. It was like 3 stories up, by carrying him with a big rope. But he couldn't help himself because he was passing out. So he finally got up and he died in her arms. That's what I read in Jacob Abig's book, Cleopatra. So I don't know where he heard that. I haven't heard that from any of the ancient books. But yeah. Augustus Caesar is now the emperor of Rome, and he changed the Constitution of Rome to give himself even more power. He made himself the leader for life for the first time. So it's actually Augustus's fault that Rome became a empire, but I guess that goes to show that you have to have one guy, because if it had been just Augustus as the consul for 1 year, and then he retires, then maybe there was some other guy. There was this power vacuum just in the general culture of Rome, and so that one guy, somebody else would take over and be worse than him. So, and Augustus left the empire as an autocratic system. The guy who took over from Augustus was another one of these emperors who didn't give up his power until he was dead, Tiberius, and he killed a bunch of people too, just like Sulla. So that's what Rome had devolved into. It had devolved into a system where people would kill your political opponents instead of discussing it in the forum, and you would grab all the power to yourself. And so the big question is, in order to control an entire empire, does it need to be run like an autocracy? Because if it isn't, then people will not follow the rule and take each other over. I think a good way to think about it is like the concept of parallel universes. I'm talking a long ass time, and I haven't even gotten started on the juicy parts. I hope this thing is still recording. I hate when I do videos and then it like Stops recording. All right, 54 minutes. My God. Okay, so, um, so yeah, like a parallel universe. Maybe there's a parallel universe where people followed they took over all of those other countries. They got rich, and then they stayed a democracy with the consuls that are only consul for 1 year. That's co-consuls, you know. And I think every day they would take over. So one consul would be the boss. So you'd only be a consul for a day. And so that made it so that people were not afraid to speak their minds. So there were more Ciceros doing all these kinds of philippics against each other, and nobody did coups against each other. So there were no civil wars. So the Roman Empire never crashes, and then we invent all the things that and like the internal combustion engines 1,500 years ago, and then we democratically and responsibly convert them into electric 50 years later, and without having a war destroying the environment, and then we have this perfectly sustainable environment without destroying any of the natural world, and we get all the lions and tigers and bears and monkeys and polar bears get to keep living, no global warming. Or we live in the world we live now where people couldn't get along, and so then it just turned into an empire that was controlled by an army. And so that's the interesting part about how all that, where I'll circle back around, how all of the interesting literature of Rome came from the very beginning of the empire, or the very end of the republic, and the very beginning of the empire. Those two periods. The people, and I think it was people's at the very maybe it's for different reasons. At the very beginning of the empire, it was people trying to preserve world culture through the new religion. Maybe they felt like trying to replace the corrupt system. The Roman Empire was corrupt in the time of all the writings of the Christian writings, and so yeah, maybe I'll talk about that. Let's talk about the similarities between the fall of the American Empire and the fall of the Roman Empire, and all of the problems with our current system and why it's not sustainable, and Rome, because it's exactly the same, exact same culture, it's exact same problems, exact same causes for problems and solutions. Okay, so, and it's the most simple freaking concept. You don't see, this is another interesting thing is how you can get all these bankers to have, Steve Mnuchin has $300 million and he works in our government. He's one of our government workers and he has $300 million. So if you look at it like at Rome, with the fascists taking over, America's looks like that. Okay, so you don't have to believe all these bankers, and think that they're smarter than you just because they know what a complex derivative is and they get all their money. And so because they have all that money and they have all their workers, well, that must mean that they're smarter than you and all that. And so don't even talk to me about it, because, and then if you go like, well, let's just raise the taxes on wealthy. Oh, you don't understand, because the whole economy will crash if you do that, because you need to be able to invest. It's like, but why can't the country invest? Oh, no, you can't have the state. You can't trust the state because the state will just try to take your freedoms. It's like, you're talking to crazy people, but because they have the money, they can pump craziness at you through the TV, and then people, I guess, aren't educated enough to, to think, realize what they're saying is crazy. So you could just say, you can just be simple and be like, don't, one guy can't be the boss of all the other guys. It's like ancient times, So anyways, you can make it really simple with the economy too. This is how you need to have a good economic system. And any 4-year-old can tell you this. You have to keep it simple. You have to keep it, you have to use technology for what it can give you, but not use technology as a weapon against you. So you just have to stay true to the past. You have to remember the past. You have to know your history, and you have to try to remember how it was and know how you can be. Not forget that you can do things. And so yeah, our society gets too complex where we have to have too many middlemen doing too many things so it ends up clogging it down. So let's just explain it really simply. You have back in the ancient times, you have a really simple society where it's just bands of people. So one person would do lots of different tasks. The mother would be the nurse, the doctor, the teacher, the provider, everything. And then if you find a piece of technology, like a Coke bottle falls out of the sky, now you have a Coke bottle that you can smack against the seeds to make the seeds make pudding for your baby, and then you can hammer in the nails for your house and stuff. Well, that's great. Technology is great, but if you allow that to cause problems, here's a perfect example: the Luddites from Scotland. They invented the machine that helped mining, and so it put a bunch of people out of or threshing the wheat. So it put a bunch of people out of business, right? So they got mad, and so that invention in itself is a beautiful thing, right? But the rich guys who own the businesses collected all the money for themselves. So then all the people got mad, and they got mad at the machine. But instead of getting mad at the threshing machine, you want to embrace the technology. You need to get mad at the rich guy for taking all the money, and so that's where this country comes in, the state. You need to pass a law that makes it so that the rich guy has to share his money with the poor people. And so that's what we need to do now. We get these new technology, and it ends up becoming a weapon against the people. For example, our educational system and our military system. It's just too bogged down. People go to school just to go to school because they're supposed to use the degree to get a job. But what they're really doing is just using taxpayer money to sit around and be bored, and then they're wasting their whole life away being bored and watching somebody drone on and then paying a bunch of money for it, and then paying somebody else to so just to do uselessness. And then maybe you graduate, and then you'll have enough money or you go to the army. You spend all the taxpayer money killing people, and then you use the money that you're paid to then go to the school to waste all your time looking at it. So you're using technology, all the electricity and the ability to build these nice buildings and to put water in the buildings, and all the administrators, and for what? Where you could just as easily do what I do and just stay in a room and learn everything yourself and become 10 times smarter than if you ever were to go to a college and spend all that money. And so the system gets so complex, and people are just getting jobs within this system that is useless. And so then people just start looking out for themselves because they're not looking at the old system. And then it all comes to a freezing halt because everybody's in debt and working all the time doing nothing. And then you have to just change all of it. And so with America, how it'll change is we'll just have to forgive everybody all the student debts. We'll have to shut down all the schools, and we'll have to tax all the wealthy, and throw all that extra money into people just riding their bikes and enjoying themselves riding their bikes and educating themselves and educating others on YouTube, and trying to convince everybody else to not spend all the taxpayer money, and forcing people to go to school, and then go off to some war, and then without ever actually being able to have your voice heard, So anyways, let's talk about the fall of Rome and how that's kind of got bogged down the same way that I'm describing America. So Rome had this big. So let's talk about empire really quick. American empire. I think America's an empire because we have our our dollar is the world currency, so everybody has to buy and sell everything based on what you charge. So you get a discount on everything. I don't know exactly. I can't explain how that works. I want to watch some economics videos, but you get about a 5% GDP boost just for having the world reserve currency and therefore being in your empire. And so I think it's the same thing with Rome. The city in ancient Rome. Rome had their general. Um, well, I mean, um, yeah, like with the city of Rome, because they were the capital of the empire, they got all that extra money coming to Rome. Just like how America gets some money, extra money coming to us, just because we're kind of like the capital of the empire of the world. And so, but there's another way that empires make money, and that's not really, that's by kind of skimming off the top. Well, I think it works differently with America than Rome. Let me talk about Rome first. The other way that Rome made money off being an empire, other than taxing all of the people in the empire, and then they could even tax them too much, because they couldn't fight back because the army was controlled by Rome. But the other way that they got money was when they first took over these places. They would go in there and they would take their treasury. So then they could use that treasury to beautify the main city of Rome. And then they would take, because they're mad at everybody, they made all of their, or because they had to, to not allow there to be another army to rise up, they had to make them slaves and bring them back. So they had all this free labor force and money. So you can trace things in Rome to specific countries that they took over. Julius Caesar's wealth and building up Rome came from the money that he got from France. Julius Caesar went to Egypt after he went to France and had a baby with Cleopatra called Caesarium. And he was very impressed with Alexandria in Egypt because it was an ancient city, 10,000 years old or whatever. Oh wait, no, not. I mean, Egypt is, but and so he wanted to beautify Rome. So he did that. He built baths and stuff, and yeah, a bunch of things with the money he got from France. And then the Colosseum was built from the money, and of course slaves from France. And the Colosseum in Rome was built from the slaves, the Jewish slaves from the kingdom of Judea that Titus took over and annexed into the Roman Empire, and then all of their treasury and the money that they took back. So Jewish slaves and money built the Colosseum. So if he had spent that money on something else, like when they in that period right after they got Judea, and he was like Commodus and had a bunch of parties and killed 800 lions, like how Commodus did in parties. Well, then you would have this legend of these fantastic parties that Titus funded, but you would have no Colosseum because you could only fund that once. Rome, if Rome had grown up, they could have funded the Colosseum with taxes if they were more responsible. But normally Rome wouldn't have just been able to fund that Colosseum. Well, actually, no, they spent money pretty. They wasted money. They would build stuff. Augustus built a huge lake just for a battle, but they did this stuff because they could from all of the people they took over. For example, what's another thing that they built when Trajan took over Dacia. He used their money. They had a bunch of gold mines, and so he took over their slaves, their gold, and their treasury, and their mines, and he used that money to dig out like 120. They dug away 120-foot high mountain. They just dug it out with manpower, pickaxes, and then he built the Trajan's column, this big, huge column that tells the story of his conquest in Dacia, in a spiral that goes up. and the spiral the spire is as high as the mountain was, just to show like how much of the mountain they moved away. And they built a whole bunch of other stuff too. So so yeah, you could trace like Baths of Diocletian. Um, um, well, a lot of things you can trace to when they first took something over. So anyway, what I'm saying is, um, wow, what rabbit hole was I going down? Um, so you, well, that's kind of similar to the American Empire. We have to understand that it's just these fleeting moments. You know, like the American Empire, we're an empire because the whole world, there was this power vacuum at the end of World War II, and we also had this young labor force with women who were used to working because they had to in World War II, and and we were able to become the world power because we had really no competition after that. And so if we're going to lose the American Empire to China in the year 2030, I guess, when they're going to pass us, we can't be mad about that because China has like 4 times as many people as we do. What we need to do is compare the personal GDP and and you know cherish our political system that we have. I think that's why the Roman Republic fell, is because they didn't. Well, they didn't even have a constitution. They had the 12 tablets, and I don't know what they say. I thought they were on my website. I could have sworn they're on my website, but they're not. In a parallel universe, they're on my website. I should have put it in this universe, but yeah, they didn't. They didn't have. They should have. They should have had it written down, like, you know, not just kill anybody who tries to become king, but you know, don't let the bankers buy off the consul and stuff like that, you know. And if that had been a golden saying, we would have remembered it for America now. Um, so yeah, but I was actually saying this to somebody else. If I wanted to compare America to Rome, and that's, if you're going to be a true American, that's what you have to do. You have to be focused on Rome, and you have to be constantly comparing America to Rome, because that's what the founding fathers of America did. If you read the Federalist Papers, Alexander Hamilton, James Monroe, and John Jay, their names, their aliases were Roman consuls from the Republic, like Publius and Tiberius and so and they were always talking about the Roman democracy and the Athenian democracy. And so if you cherish that and you're constantly talking about that, and if the Romans had done that, then it would be, people would have a lot less tolerance for people doing autocratic things and for people getting too rich, which then because Crassus would have turned himself into a king. He already was like one third of a king. So yeah, we just need to, one thing we need to remember is that there was no real literature after Cicero. Cicero wrote 3,000 pages of philosophy, just like the ancient Greeks. Like, we have all these ancient Greeks with all this Greek philosophy, and the only real philosopher we have talking about stuff is like you have Cicero, and then there were some writers like at the very beginning of the empire, like Seneca, but there was no other writing, and even historians. There were no historians in the autocratic Roman Empire because nobody trusted each other. You couldn't write a history book because it would just be the emperor's like story about how he cheated everybody or he didn't even know anything, and then that book would be destroyed the next year. So yeah, just if you're talking about history books, you have Livy was at the very beginning of the empire. He wrote a 3,000-page book. Pliny was at the very beginning of the empire. Sallust was at Democratic time, Republican times. Cicero, all those guys. Caesar. Then you become an empire, and then it's nothing. If you talk about Emperor, what's his name? There was this emperor who was another one of these buffoon emperors. He tried to make he married a Vestal virgin. He was originally from Syria. His religion was Sol Invictus, and he became emperor when he was 14, just because he was part of like the right dynasty. I think it was the Severan dynasty, the tail end of it. I can't remember his name. Elagabalus, and he. Oh shit! I lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, there's no first-hand story of that whole time period. There were no literate people. Even though they had the money of an empire, it was like they were going into the Dark Ages literacy-wise. All of the history that Edward Gibbon collected to write the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire of Elagabalus in that time period was just from bits and pieces from people who live like 100 years after. Okay, so, and the reason for that was, and I think it was Livy who described it, who explained it, or no, it was there was another guy who was at the very beginning of the empire, Tacitus, who described that. That yeah, people just you're afraid to talk and you can't talk and it's not allowed to talk, and so, and then there's no investment in education and it's just war, and so. Yeah, that's kind of what's happening now. Wasting money. Okay, but wait, let me talk about. I'm like super sidetracked. This is the stoner version. Okay, so, shit, this person's gonna keep calling me back. I gotta wrap this up. So yeah, we. Wait, I'll just turn the phone off. Just a sec. Turn the phone off. Just a second. There we go. Okay, so, Rome. So when you this is the main lesson. When you get, you have to be historical, and you have to think like natural. You have to treat people naturally. When we took the Apaches out of New Mexico and brought them into South Carolina, they all died because they didn't know any of the plants. They weren't natives. They were Native Americans, but they weren't native South Carolinians. And so that's how humans are. And Noam Chomsky talks about this a lot. We have brains, and we're smart, and we strategize, and we work hard, and we try to memorize things, and we try to have relationships with people. And so if you take those natural tendencies away, then people are going to become unhealthy, and they're going to become like, in order to survive, you either numb down and become retarded and do what people tell you to do, or you rebel and you fight back, and if you're not educated in the first place, you fight back in a bad way. And so so you need to preserve those tendencies of humans whenever you turn into an empire. And so you need to respect those. You can't have people just be subjects and then, like America, making somebody go to school just to get the degree and then follow the teacher because that could fail you and then you're lost. The autocratic system, or in the corporation, people trying to backstab each other in order to get extra points to get to the next level, and then you backstab each other to get to the next level. So by the time you get to the highest level, it's a bunch of backstabbers. and and nobody knows anything because you spend all of your time trying to become good at trickery and stuff. And so what we need to do is we need to realize that that's what destroyed the Roman Empire. Cicero got his head cut off for talking, and that was in the Republic. So yeah, we need to just stay educated and talk and communicate, and not put anybody above anybody else in terms of thinking somebody's. There's a lot to talk about. I mean, you could do another video about the end of the Roman Empire, because that's when it was really bad. Oh yeah, let me talk about the fall of Roman Empire. So Rome was this huge empire, and the empire is going to crash when the taxes are too high, and you can't get any taxes. When you're having a combination, you're going to have a really good country if you can get lots of taxes and the taxes are low. Rome and America were the opposite. Rome, they taxed everybody in order to maintain an army, but they couldn't get the tax money because the landowners were just kind of fighting each other and starting their own armies. That's why Diocletian had to break up all the provinces into little provinces, because if they were too big, they would start their own country. And so that was how he could maintain control, but that increased the prices, the cost of the army, because then the administrative costs. You had lots of the same administrative jobs in all the different little provinces, and he streamlined the army a little bit by making smaller units that were more equestrian, but yeah. So then it eventually fell. Like, people saw the writing on the wall. Like, there were people. You're officially part of the Roman Empire, but at the same time, you don't pay taxes, and you have your own private army, and you don't rely on the Roman army, And so that's kind of like how America's going. You have all these rich people who are officially Americans, but at the same time, they want to send their own kids to their own schools and live in their own towns and villages and fly around and have their own friends and their own economic system. But then at the same time, they want to they're really rich, and their companies get really rich off of the taxes of the country that they supposedly have. And if you talk to the bankers like Julia Prinz, and that's how it works. They just like a company, like it's called socializing the gains, privatizing the gains, and socializing the losses. So they use people's taxpayer money to subsidize their auto industry, and then when they go bankrupt from embezzling it, they just the country, our taxpayers, bail them out, and then they get to keep their bonuses the next year. Anyways, that's another video. So that's basically my video on the fall of the Roman Republic and the beginning of the empire. It's I don't think you have to have in order to have a world system, world empire, it doesn't have to be an autocracy. If you're going to talk about the beauty of Rome, everything about the beauty of Rome was from when it was a Roman Republic. Rome was taking over all those other cities, city-states and countries and ethnic groups and other empires because they were democratic, and because the other ones were autocratic. And that's where their pride came in. That's where, like when a consul went out to do negotiation with another king, you couldn't bribe that consul because he wouldn't be the consul the next year, and he would get prosecuted for being bribed because everybody knew what was going on. And they were pretty good at prosecuting people for doing that. And but at the same time, he had the power of a king. There's this story, I think it was maybe Jugurtha or something. One of the consuls went to a king, and he wrote he drew a circle of the sand around the king or around himself, and he's like, if you step out of that without giving me my concession, then we're gonna go to war. And he's like, and that's my decision, So you're anyway. It was like, and so that's what America is. This is one last thing I want to talk about in this video. America, if you wanted to compare America with Rome, I mean, if you wanted to compare America, yeah, America with Rome, like two periods of history, I would compare America in 2018 with Rome, um, Rome, like 250 BC, like Rome right before the Punic Wars. Okay, so in Rome right before the Punic Wars, you have the known world. Okay, you have Rome and you have Carthage, the two superpowers. Rome is a democratically, and then maybe Greece over here. Rome is a democratically elected democracy, democratic republic where, I mean, as democratic as you can get. You're only a consul for a day, or it's two consuls, and they're only consuls for a year, and then they have to get reelected a few years later, and then they're only consul for again. If they want to be consul again, they have to get reelected, and they have to wait a year, and then it's against versus the Carthaginians, who are this plutocratic, small knit group of rich Jewish traders, not Jewish, but rich like ex-Phoenician traders, who then pay out their lower classes to do all their dirty work for them, including the army. And then over in Greece you have a kingdom of Philip, so there's the snapshot, and you go, well, which one of all these different ones are going to survive? Well, it's going to be the Romans, of course, because they all have pride in their people, and they're the country of the people, and there's social mobility because you can get elected, and meritocracy, and so sure enough, Rome takes over the whole world, and they have the Roman Senate, and sure it's an autocracy, but that was the one that took over the world. It wasn't one of these little kingdom these plutocratic aristocratic kingdoms. And so let's fast forward to now. You have China over here that has 1.2 billion people. You have Russia up here that has like half of the landmass of the earth. And then you have America over here, and then you have like all these little ancient city-states of Europe over here, and then you have dysfunctional Africa, or like the barbarian primitive Africa, and then dysfunctional South America. And up here you have America, the most democratic of all the countries. So if you're gonna predict, well, okay, what's gonna happen in the future? Well, a lot of people like to predict, oh no, America's gonna go down because China has got the landmass. They're gonna build this super highway rail system with solar powered rail systems to do trading with Russia and Europe, and we're gonna lose all the business and we're gonna go down. But I think it's better to predict a future based on, and the success of countries based on their current political system. China is an autocratically dictatorship. Their president is a president for life. He's a king. Russia, their president is president for life. He's the king, richest man in the world, Putin. We have these presidents who go for 4 years, and then they have to re-elect them, rerun again for another 4 years, and then they can only go a maximum of 8 years, and then they can never run again. And I think maybe when our founding fathers wrote the Constitution, they may have had Roman in mind, because I've seen the Roman lists a lot of times on my timeline, and there's like a maximum of 6 times consul. Maybe one guy was 8-time consul, but never more than 8 times. So they're probably trying to keep it to that. But so then So who's going to be the successful country in the future that's going to take over the whole world? When you're talking about in the next empire, I'd say America. I don't think it's the end of the American empire. I think it's the beginning of the American empire. We may lose the world currency as the dollar. We're definitely not going to be the strongest GDP in the world because we don't have the biggest population, but we have the most effective political system. So we're the most freest society. So we can make the quickest adjustments if we have to, and we can make the quickest change and have the smartest people. So we could end up culturally continuing to take over the world, and of course the rules are going to change anyway. It's not commerce like we'll lose power because China will make all the money with the high-speed rails with Europe. We're going to take over the world because of the respect that we have. That's why Rome was always took over the world, because people had respect for him. There was one kingdom somewhere like in Turkey or somewhere like that, where the guy died and he didn't have a son, so he just gave his kingdom to Rome. Okay? So that's basically, I mean, if America's good enough, people will just want to get annexed by America, like how Texas wanted to, you know? That's how you make people spread your culture, is you make them want to join you. So those are the lessons we can learn. Just don't let oligarchy protect the education and the democracy. Don't start these wars, so we can have the money for education, and then we can move on and we can stay. But I think also stay true to the idea of democracy. Julius Caesar, at the end of the day, even though he was smart and bequeathed his stuff to the people, because he made himself autocrat for his lifetime, then he's bad. You have to give him bad grades. Same thing with Augustus. And I'm sure that and I don't know, maybe when you get in that kind of power, you have different insights. But as far as I can tell, you want to be as democratic as you can. Okay, so that's enough talking. I tried to keep it down, but that's a big subject. Another subject I could do about is the fall of Rome, but I've talked about that a lot. Okay. Hopefully, is this still recording? Okay, good. All right, peace.